Does navigating complex finances feel like an impossible task? Now imagine doing it for an entire empire teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Anastasius I faced that exact challenge, and his ingenious solutions didn't just save Rome, they redefined its economic future. Discover the surprisingly modern fiscal strategies of this economist emperor that are still relevant today. The economist emperor Anastasius I and the quiet invention of imperial power. The familiar story of Roman greatness, whether told in Latin for the Old Empire or in Greek for the Eastern, prefers the clang of weapons to the scratching of pens. Emperors are weighed by provinces conquered, rivals broken, monuments raised so high that even a hostile century must look up. In that scale, Anastasius I often appears as an interlude, a careful, elderly administrator between more dramatic reigns, a pious man of the palace who held the line but did not redraw the map. It is not wrong. Under Anastasius, no new world was taken, no Carthage refounded, no Italy reclaimed. The empire's borders still bled in places. Its religious quarrels remained radioactive, and yet, quietly, almost stubbornly, something changed that would matter as much as any victory, not the empire's reach, but its capacity. Not the splendor of the court, but the credibility of the state.
Welcome to the Epic History Tales channel. Subscribe to the channel if you want to watch similar videos.
In late 5th century Constantinople, the empire still called itself Roman, and in law it still was. But the Western court had collapsed. The Mediterranean's old unity had become a memory, and the Eastern government faced a more prosaic danger than invasion: fiscal exhaustion. Armies could win battles and still lose the century. If pay failed, if supplies vanished into corruption, if taxpayers fled into poverty or into the protection of magnates. By the time Anastasius took the purple in 491, the empire's problem was not simply enemies at the gates. It was that the gates themselves, customs posts, tax offices, storehouses, mints, had become unreliable instruments. Anastasius was not born with a general's reputation. He came from Dyrrhachium on the Adriatic, rose through the palace as a financial and administrative official, and arrived on the throne by a choice that was at once political and practical. Ariadne, widow of Emperor Zeno, needed a stable successor. The court needed a man who could hold the apparatus together. The empire needed, above all, solvency. Later writers would leave an arresting claim that Anastasius died with an immense surplus in the treasury, measured in hundreds of thousands of pounds, of gold, figures that modern historians debate in scale and precision, but not in direction. He left the state rich by the standards of his age. If one were to translate that achievement into a modern metaphor, it would resemble a major power with a national debt so low as to seem almost fictional in contemporary terms, less than 5% of what the state produced in a year. The number itself cannot be carried across 15 centuries as a strict statistic. Ancient GDP is an estimate at best, and national debt did not function like modern bond markets. Yet the comparison clarifies the shock. An imperial government, widely assumed to be decaying, ended a reign with money in reserve, with obligations manageable, with the capacity to spend without immediate collapse. This is where the myth of history begins to reverse. The empire did not survive because it clung to old glory. It survived because someone treated the treasury as a weapon system. The surprise is not merely that Anastasius saved money. It is how he made saving possible without shrinking the state into irrelevance. In an age when rulers often treated taxes as a lever to be pulled harder whenever coin ran short, Anastasius recognized something modern governments still struggle to admit. The structure of extraction matters as much as its total. A state can tax itself into weakness and then discover that weakness invites conquest. If the story ended with a hoard of gold, it would be moralizing and simple, prudence rewarded. But Anastasius's achievement was not just frugality, it was design. He changed which burdens were carried, who carried them, and how the empire's arteries, roads, couriers, mints, storehouses, moved information and goods. The empire's war chest was built not by a single stroke, but by the slow removal of hidden leaks. And the first leak he addressed was a tax, so hated that its name survived like a curse. The chrysargyron, also known as the collatio lustralis, was not the sort of levy that struck only the rich and powerful. It reached into workshops and markets, into the uncertain economy of artisans and small traders, into the daily breath of the city. It was assessed periodically, traditionally every 4 years, and it fell upon those engaged in commerce, shopkeepers, craftsmen, and a wide shadow of people whose livelihoods did not fit neatly into the old agrarian categories. In a world where cash was scarce for many and credit could be predatory, the tax could mean forced sales, debt, humiliation. Ancient sources describe families selling possessions, even children, to meet assessments. Such accounts carry rhetorical heat. They are written to praise the reformer and condemn the old system. Yet, even allowing for exaggeration, the picture is consistent across the tradition. This was a tax that made ordinary economic life feel like a trap. One way to understand the chrysargyron is to strip it of its antique name and see its function. It was a consumption and transaction burden imposed in a complex society that increasingly depended on cash exchange. Its cruelty lay not only in the rate but in its timing. An administration, lumpy, periodic, and enforced by officials whose incentives could easily drift toward extraction for its own sake. In modern Europe, debates over high or complex value-added taxes often circle the same anxiety, that a state can tax transactions so broadly and administer them so heavily that it discourages the very activity it needs: formation of new businesses, growth in trade, the willingness to declare income honestly rather than hide it. The analogy is imperfect, but it illuminates the political reality. People do not resent taxation only because it costs money. They resent it because it feels like contempt, because it punishes initiative and turns daily life into a negotiation with fear. Anastasius abolished it. The act has the clarity of a dramatic scene. Imagine Constantinople's markets: spices, cloth, metalwork, bread, under the shadow of a levy that returns like an illness. Then imagine a proclamation that removes it, not by reduction, not by postponement, but by elimination. Sources describe celebration: lamps lit, public joy, the sense that a predatory hand had been withdrawn from the throat of the city. Here, the conventional assumption would predict danger: remove a major tax, and revenue collapses. Armies still require pay, walls still require repair, officials still demand salaries, a state already strained cannot afford generosity, and yet the empire under Anastasius did not go bankrupt, it grew more stable. The counterintuitive result invites an argument still fought in modern language, that reducing a heavy distortionary tax can expand the taxable base, encourage compliance, stimulate commerce, and ultimately raise or stabilize total revenue. Supply-side economics, in its later formulations, would make grand claims that often exceed the evidence. Anastasius's case does not prove a universal law, but it does demonstrate a narrower, harder truth. Some taxes are so destructive, so costly to administer, and so politically poisonous that their removal can strengthen the state even if it reduces immediate intake from that particular line. How? Partly through psychology. A government that removes an hated burden gains legitimacy, and legitimacy is a kind of revenue. Partly through administration. When a tax invites evasion and corruption, much of what is collected never reaches the treasury anyway. And partly through economic behavior. Artisans who can plan without periodic ruin invest more, trade more, and produce more, creating other streams of taxation: customs duties, market fees, land-related revenues, less corrosive than the chrysargyron's reach. But any honest account must pause here. Anastasius did not abolish the chrysargyron in a vacuum of painless choices. The state still needed money. Removing one tax meant relying more heavily on others, and the burden could shift toward land and rural producers. The popular glow in the cities could cast a longer shadow in the countryside. Fiscal justice in an empire was rarely a simple redistribution from rich to poor. It was often a reshuffling of who had the political power to complain. Even so, the abolition mattered because it signaled a philosophy. The empire would not survive by squeezing every available throat. It would survive by making the system workable enough that people remained inside it. That signal did not end the empire's fiscal crisis on its own. It set the tone for what followed: a deliberate renovation of the mechanisms by which the state moved, counted, and restrained itself. For the chrysargyron was only one monster. Behind it stood a whole ecology of inefficiency, services that had become opportunities for graft, obligations that fell unevenly, and logistics so burdened that even honest officials struggled to keep pace. To turn abolition into solvency, Anastasius had to do something less theatrical than cutting a hated tax. He had to rebuild the plumbing of the imperial machine. The Roman state had long relied on the cursus publicus, the official transport and communication system. It was not merely a mail service, it was the nervous system of government, relays of horses, stations, wagons, permits, and personnel that carried dispatches, officials, supplies, and sometimes soldiers. An empire without reliable communication is an empire that discovers rebellions late, collects taxes poorly, and pays armies after they have already mutinied. Roads and couriers are not romantic, but they are decisive. The problem was that the cursus publicus, like many imperial institutions, was both essential and abused. Burdens fell on local communities compelled to provide animals, labor, or provisioning. Officials could requisition beyond what was lawful. Exemptions could be bought. Corruption turned necessity into predation. When the state's logistics become a private privilege, the empire's credibility collapses at the same speed as its messages. Anastasius's reforms here appear in fragments across the sources, less celebrated than the abolition of the chrysargyron, but no less revealing. He pursued administrative tightening, clarifying obligations, restraining abuses, and attempting to make state services predictable rather than arbitrary. The details in surviving evidence can be uneven, and historians debate how far his hand reached into every office. The late antique bureaucracy was vast, and no emperor could micromanage it all. Yet, the broader pattern is visible in what did change unmistakably under his reign. Waste was hunted, and revenue was made to arrive. To understand the significance, it helps to redefine what power meant in the 6th century Eastern Empire. Power was not only the ability to raise an army, it was the ability to keep an army raised. It was not only to issue laws, it was to have those laws carried on time, enforced without bribery, and accepted as real. A state's strength lay in the reliability of its promises, pay to soldiers, justice to subjects, provisions to cities. Modern governments speak of credit ratings and bond markets as if these are abstract judges. Late Rome had no such institutions in the modern sense, but it did have something like a living credit, the willingness of people to deliver grain, to accept coin as trustworthy, to serve in offices without immediate predation as their only compensation. Anastasius approached governance like an auditor who believes the empire is not doomed, only mismanaged. He tightened budgets, he scrutinized expenditures. He looked for revenue already owed but not collected, and for expenses paid but not producing value. There is a temptation to turn such language into praise by default, to imagine an emperor heroically slashing waste. Yet even here, multiple perspectives are necessary. To cut expenditure can mean starving genuine needs. To enforce collection can mean hardening the state's hand upon those least able to resist. Efficiency is a virtue of systems, not always of outcomes, and still the results suggest competence, not cruelty for its own sake. The imperial fisc, especially the private treasury of the emperor, the res privata, alongside the public finances, appears to have been handled with unusual discipline. Anastasius also undertook one of the most tangible economic reforms of late antiquity, the improvement of the copper coinage. In 498, he introduced large denomination copper coins, notably the phallus marked with clear value indicators. This was not mere numismatic trivia. In an empire where daily transactions depended on small change, stable and comprehensible copper coinage eased market exchange, reduced the friction of trade, and made taxation and payments more functional. A state that pays soldiers and suppliers with coin people trust does not need to pay a premium for distrust. Coinage reform also carried a message. The emperor was willing to reshape the state's tools rather than simply demand more from its subjects. The most effective fiscal policies are often those that make ordinary compliance easier than evasion, not through terror alone, but through making the system legible. None of this occurred in peaceful isolation. Anastasius faced the Isaurian War early in his reign, a conflict born of internal power struggles after Zeno, fought with real expense and real stakes. Later, the empire confronted threats along the Danube and navigated a tense relationship with Sasanian Persia, culminating in war at the very end of Anastasius's life. Walls had to be strengthened, troops paid, diplomacy financed. One of his most enduring physical legacies, the Long Wall of Thrace, an ambitious defensive line west of Constantinople, was itself a statement of priorities: conserve the core, defend the capital's approaches, reduce the cost of constant raiding by turning geography into an ally. Here again, the argument sharpens. Military success is not only a product of battlefield genius, it is also a product of whether soldiers are paid on time, whether fortifications are maintained, whether grain arrives, whether the state can absorb a bad year without panic. Anastasius's reforms were not a retreat from power, they were power expressed in a different language. By the later years of his reign, the empire possessed something rare in late antiquity: fiscal breathing room, and breathing room changes what a state can imagine. It changes the horizon of possibility, it turns survival into strategy. That is when the story of Anastasius becomes inseparable from a more famous name, Justinian, not because Anastasius dreamed Justinian's conquests, but because he made them financially conceivable. Ancient sources and later traditions emphasize the treasure Anastasius left behind. Procopius, writing in the age of Justinian and colored by the politics of his own time, speaks of an enormous reserve. Other evidence supports the broad claim that the treasury was full, even if the exact sums are disputed. The image is vivid: storehouses of coin, the cold shine of gold solidi, stacked not as plunder from victory but as the residue of restraint. Translated into a modern metaphor, it resembles a state that has not merely balanced its budget, but accumulated surpluses so significant that its standing in the world shifts. In contemporary terms, low debt to GDP ratios can translate into cheaper borrowing, strategic flexibility, and the ability to respond to crises without immediate fiscal panic. Germany, often cited as relatively disciplined by modern European standards, sits around the mid-range of debt to GDP compared to many peers. Japan's burden, soaring above 250%, is a different kind of predicament. Sustainable for reasons of domestic financing and monetary policy, yet still a constraint on imagination. These comparisons do not map cleanly onto antiquity, because Anastasius did not issue long-term sovereign debt on a global market the way modern states do. But the underlying principle, fiscal space equals strategic space, remains recognizable across the centuries. The empire Justinian, inherited in 527, was not merely intact, it was liquid. Justinian's reign would become synonymous with grand ambition: the rebuilding of Hagia Sophia after the Nika riot, the codification of Roman law, and above all, the reconquests: Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, parts of Spain from the Visigoths. These campaigns were not paid for with courage alone. They were paid for with coin, logistics, and the administrative capacity to keep paying when victories turned into grinding occupations. Even Justinian's monumental building program, stone, labor, transport, artisan work, was a fiscal act on a colossal scale. It is tempting to give Justinian the entire credit, and in terms of decisions and risks, he deserves much. Yet to treat his achievements as purely personal vision is to miss the deeper causality. Justinian's grandeur rested on a platform of solvency that he did not create. He inherited it. The direct link between Anastasius's frugality and Justinian's magnificence is not a sentimental chain of virtue rewarded. It is an example of how states behave when their finances are healthy. A government with reserves can take risks, it can absorb shocks, it can finance projects that do not pay immediate returns, it can pursue glory. But this link also complicates Anastasius's legacy. A full treasury is morally neutral. It can fund cathedrals or wars that bleed provinces dry. Justinian's reconquests, for all their splendor, would strain the empire, especially when plague and renewed wars arrived. In hindsight, one can argue that Anastasius's savings were spent on a dream too expensive to sustain. Another view sees the reconquests as rational attempts to restore the Mediterranean economy and secure vital resources, made plausible only because Anastasius had done the unglamorous work of making the state solvent. Both interpretations can coexist because they measure success differently. If success is immediate expansion, Justinian towers. If success is institutional survival, Anastasius becomes harder to dismiss. This is the redefinition at the heart of the story. Imperial greatness is not only the act of taking, it is the ability to keep. The emperor who leaves gold behind may, in the long run, shape events as decisively as the emperor who spends it in triumph. Anastasius's reign also reveals the cost of governing through fiscal reform. The same emperor who could ignite joy by abolishing a tax could also ignite fury through religious policy and court factions. In 512, Constantinople saw serious unrest tied to religious disputes, with crowds and soldiers, slogans, and fear. An emperor may balance accounts and still fail to balance beliefs. Stability has multiple currencies, and not all can be minted, and yet when Anastasius died in 508, the Eastern Empire did not die with him. It continued with an unusual confidence for a state that, a generation earlier, had seemed trapped in late antique paralysis. In the final accounting, the economist emperor offers lessons that are less like commandments than lenses through which to reinterpret power. First, beyond the battlefield, finance is not a background detail, it is a cornerstone of sovereignty. Armies march on pay as much as on grain. Laws endure when officials can be compensated without selling justice. Diplomacy succeeds when gifts and subsidies can be offered without humiliation. In any century, a state's independence is measured partly by how little it must beg from the future. Second, Anastasius's story resonates because it suggests that fiscal responsibility is not simply austerity. It is architecture. He did not merely hoard, he redesigned incentives by removing a tax that distorted economic life. He tightened administrative channels where corruption siphoned strength, and he improved the practical currency of everyday exchange. In modern 2026, governments wrestling with budget pressures, high-debt nations such as the United States, often cited above 120% of GDP, or Italy, frequently placed above 140%, confront dilemmas that feel different in mechanism but similar in logic. How to maintain legitimacy while collecting revenue, how to restrain waste without starving capacity, how to reform taxation without strangling growth. A state overburdened by obligations can find that every crisis becomes existential. A state with fiscal space can choose among imperfect options rather than be driven into the worst one. Third, Anastasius demonstrates that economic policy is political policy. Abolishing the chrysargyron was not merely a technocratic correction. It was a declaration of what kind of relationship the state would have with its subjects. Efficiency purchased legitimacy, and legitimacy purchased compliance. Yet the story also warns that reforms create winners and losers. Some celebrate the lighter hand, others bear new burdens elsewhere. The empire's wealth was not conjured from nothing. It was gathered, and gathering always has a human cost. So the image that remains is not of a conqueror on horseback, but of an elderly emperor in the palace, in lamplight, where ledgers mattered as much as swords. Outside, Constantinople's harbors creaked with commerce, its churches murmured with disputed doctrine, its walls watched the horizon. Inside, the empire's future was being negotiated in numbers. History often remembers the spender of treasure more vividly than the one who accumulated it, but the treasury Anastasius built was not simply money. It was time, it was resilience. It was the ability to act. And in the long life of the Eastern Roman Empire, an empire that would endure for nearly 1,000 years after the West fell, resilience may be the most underestimated form of grandeur. In the end, Anastasius does not fit neatly into a heroic portrait. He can be seen as a savior of stability, or as a cautious ruler whose wealth financed later overreach. He can be praised as a reformer who relieved the common marketplace, or criticized as a fiscal hardener who ensured the state got its due. The evidence permits multiple emphases because the empire he governed was complex enough to produce contradictory truths at once. Yet, if the question is why the Roman state in the East did not merely survive the 5th century, but entered the 6th with renewed ambition, one answer lies not in battlefields, but in balance sheets in the quiet, disciplined, controversial genius of Anastasius Pharaoh, and if forgotten strategies and unsung, administrators have shaped empires as surely as famous conquerors. The question remains open for debate. Which figure, ancient or modern, deserves to be remembered as the greatest economic reformer, one who truly mastered national debt, or created a surplus so powerful it rewrote what a state could dare to do?